The enterprise always struggles, right? They realize AI is an existential threat in multiple ways. One, if you don't start using it, someone else who does might be a lot faster, cheaper, more effective in their area. On the other hand, if you use it incorrectly, you may end up paying some huge fines or actually going out of business. So that's where we are today. It's an imperative. It's still very hard to do. And a lot of those first generation architectures are just dead wrong. The idea of bulk copying the data is ridiculous. You do not need a vector database to do RAG. They're in no way, shape, or form need to be combined. The idea that RAG is owned by the vector databases is absurd. You can use AI today without bulk moving your data, without a big ETL project, and without risking your job sending it out to some unknown third party with a questionable SOC 2.
Welcome to ODSC's AIX Podcast, your gateway to the latest in AI and data science. This episode is sponsored by ODSC East, the premier AI Builders Conference, celebrating its 10th year this May 13th to 15th in Boston. Learn more at odsc.com/Boston and use the code ODSC Podcast for an exclusive 10% discount. Seamus McGovern, the founder of ODSC, will be your host today.
Welcome back to the ODSC Podcast. Today, we're diving into a topic that doesn't get nearly enough attention: AI-powered search in the enterprise. And what happens when the data your AI needs is scattered across relational databases, data warehouses, email servers, ticketing systems, Salesforce, and more. Joining me is Sid Probstein, a veteran technology leader, 10-time CTO, and now CEO of SWIRL. This is a wide-ranging conversation about how companies can build intelligent AI systems without having to move all their data into one place. We'll talk about why so many current AI architectures fall short, how AI search differs from RAG, how federated search is being reimagined with large language models, and what all of this means for the future of agentic AI governance and even employment. So if you're building AI in the enterprise or just trying to make sense of all the tools that are out there, this episode is for you. Sid, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Sid, delighted to be talking to you again. You've given a number of talks at ODSC over the years, but today we want to have a pretty wide range of discussion around AI search, privacy, and other topics. But first, can you introduce yourself? Tell us about your current role and maybe some pivotal moments in your career.
Be delighted. I have been lucky to be 10 times CTO for different startup ventures in the Boston area. Currently, I am first-time CEO for SWIRL, really a project, a labor of love. I was working on putting together a bunch of separate indices, different search engines, and trying to put them into one search engine so we could have one search box that rule them all. And I gave up after getting 2 of the 5 sources done. It was so much work, and really a lot of search engines and databases, they're not designed to deal with many different types of data. They can store records, but articles, chat messages, database records, and complicated application records. Like, you can't just put those things all together. I gave up and started with an old approach, a technology that has been used before, federated search. Traditional search engines are about taking the data, analyzing it, and building a structure like the one at the back of many books, the index, except instead of giving you what word leads to what page, it tells you what web page, right, or some other document location. But if you have lots and lots of those indices, rather than trying to combine them all into one Uber index, the idea is to take the user's question or query and send it out to each one of those indices, let each one come up with its answer, and then try to knit that back together. For a long time, especially in the enterprise, totally impractical. For starters, just to be able to connect one system to another might be difficult. Another was really different protocols. Applications would implement their own protocols, their own security mechanisms, and that's why there's so much data sprawl in the enterprise. But in the last 5 years, most of the workloads and systems have moved to cloud, right? That's a big change. In addition, they use standards-based authentication mechanisms like single sign-on, OAuth 2, etc. So that change unlocked the possibility of federated search. After all, you and I already have dozens of search engines at our disposal. I did a talk previously where an automatic transcript was generated and emailed to me. The person I was chatting with said, "How long would it take you to index this document?" This transcript of our talk was indexed because it had already landed in my Microsoft Outlook email inbox, which is searchable immediately. You can search your email. So I could already find that. But now there isn't search capability. There's tons of it. And there's OneDrive and ServiceNow and my help desk and my intranet and the ticket system and all of the websites that I to track my competitors or understand the open source projects I'm using. It's a lot, but it's all connectable. The idea was, let's take the user's query, being able to reach them now, not having different protocols, right? Everything's standards-based authentication mechanism, like I said, and maybe HTTP, right? The web protocol. So if you do that, now your problem is I have a whole bunch of responses from all these different systems, all different types. It could be a snippet of a chat conversation, or a database record. It could be a spreadsheet. It could be a record in a database or application. How do we make sense of that? That's when GPT-3 showed up, right? And the first wave of usable embeddings, which is like the inner layers of the generative AI, the stuff that understands how text relates to each other. So I started using that to re-rank. It started as a project, a prototype. I put it out there, finished a project I was working on, came back, and I had a bunch of people who had downloaded the open source version and said, hey, this is cool. Could you do this? I can't show my boss JSON. Could you build a user interface? I need to connect this to Microsoft 365. And of course, then people started asking for lots of sources, all right? So here we are a couple of years later, and we have thousands of 20,000+ Docker Hub pulls, couple thousand stars on our repo. And we have a lot of folks in the enterprise who are using SWIRL as the alternative to what the mainstream architecture for AI is. And so that's very exciting and keeping us very busy, but we're really enjoying watching the evolution of the market, which has been fast and furious. The enterprise always struggles, right? We see these things like AI, it's massively impactful, and what's possible occurs first in the consumer space. Now, the consumers take that for granted. They expect a little AI assistant in every app and every service they use. In the enterprise, they're just starting to get a handle on it because they're very concerned with privacy and security. They realize AI is an existential threat in multiple ways. One, if you don't start using it, someone else who does might be a lot faster, cheaper, more effective in their area. On the other hand, if you use it incorrectly, you may end up paying some huge fines or actually going out of business. So that's where we are today. It's an imperative. It's still very hard to do. And a lot of those first generation architectures are just dead wrong.
That's quite the powerful statement there, Sid. Some of those AI architectures are dead wrong. I love that. You've given me so much to unpack there. So just to set context for our audience, as you mentioned, federated search has been around a long time. And I want to get into how AI is turbocharging federated search, because something we struggle right now in RAG is relevancy ranking, contextual understanding, and all that stuff. So we'll get into that as well. But then I want to go back a little bit to what you said, just so our users don't miss this, because we have data lakes, data lake houses, structured databases, unstructured databases. But you mentioned emails, a bunch of different data sources. I'm assuming the federated search can search all those different disparate data sources. But your last very powerful statement, what you called Main Street AI architecture. So let's put it in context. So when you're talking about first generation AI architecture, Main Street AI architecture, are you talking about fine tuning LLMs? Are you talking about LLMs with RAG?
A lot of it is RAG, right? And then initial engagement with LLMs is so powerful and compelling. Talk to ChatGPT and it can give you answers. So people want that experience on their data. But ChatGPT is born from data, right? It is literally the derivative of a massive amount of information being processed very cleverly. So if you give it your data, what does that mean? Turns out fine tuning with your raw data doesn't accomplish that much. It doesn't make it able to answer the facts of your business. It just makes it familiar with the terminology. I'm sure you've heard of hallucination, or it's a very common thing with LLMs, and there's leaderboards for it, and that's a lot of the difference between the models. That is a great way to make a hallucinating system, is to try to feed it the very small amount of information that's in your enterprise. Realize that those GAIs, all of them, they came from the web. One of the biggest data sets ever built. The next wave of LLMs are going to be very interesting. All the current LLMs are generalist. They know a little bit about everything. They may know more about some things than others. The next wave of LLMs, the ones that are really going to freak people out, are the ones that are going to be built by the content holders with much deeper content than the web, right? Like LexisNexis, Thomson Reuters. The content holders can build unbelievably intelligent systems based on understanding and learning the content and the text, and that's where fine-tuning comes in. But in the enterprise, you can't just feed a database of Snowflake into a GAI and expect it to make sense of it. It won't even be able to count things. Feed it 100 contracts, say, how many contracts do I have? It has no idea. It will understand your contracts well, but it doesn't have an inventory of them. And so that's part of the challenge with AI. Take generalist LLMs, and then let's do RAG. By the way, RAG is great because it reduces hallucination. It gives you data to focus on that's presumably from your organization. Instead of trying to be the answer and know the answer. Just help find the answer in a sea of data. We can talk about that. I think that's a very interesting side of it. But when you take the idea that there's all these data sources and I can't just merge it into it, so then RAG's where the error occurs. Now let's just talk about RAG for a second. Retrieval augmented generation. A nicer term, I think, is grounded generation. But either way, it's a prompt. I have a couple blog posts on this. You're going to take some data and write a prompt the same way you would with ChatGPT. Like, given the following spreadsheet, data results, excerpts from a document, from a report, from a status report, from a presentation, summarize or answer the following question. That's the kind of prompt that you end up creating in RAG. The part in RAG is running a search to find the things you want to include. So you run a search, find what's out there, bring it back, rank the best stuff, and then bind that into the prompt and ask the AI to help you. It's a massive time saver because it will read your articles for you. It will answer your question, right? It can do lots of interesting things. But the mistake is that you have to move your data to do RAG. And this is a pure vendor promoted thing. There's a whole industry, the vector database industry. They raised like $500 million and they are little more than, they're awesome. Don't get me wrong. For many use cases, they're awesome, but they're not that much more than search engines with vectors capabilities on top. Search engines from OpenSearch to Google BigQuery, which is actually a database, and Postgres, they all can do the same thing. They all have embedding support now. So there's no magic to the vector database. The magic is you have to move the data in order to use it with RAG. That's not true at all. You can RAG right off of OneDrive or Microsoft Outlook or Box or ServiceNow. A lot of these things have RAG built in too for their repository. But the point is, they all have search engines. They all have search APIs. They all do relevancy ranking. Many of them can or will very soon support embeddings. So you don't have to move your data to take advantage of it. A lot of the efforts where it makes sense to do that is if you are in e-commerce. If you're in e-commerce, you're going to test every single search engine that comes out. Because if its algorithms, for whatever reason, give you 0.5% improvement over your current baseline, that's money. So that's an e-commerce conversion is a commodity, right? There's a whole industry that focuses on that. And I think that's a space where it's no brainer. Plus, you're trying to put the data out in public anyway, right? If you're going to offer your catalog, so it's not security centric, but the idea that you want to take information that's been placed in numerous fine-grained repositories, carefully secured through zero trust models and a variety of additional add-on technologies, you're just going to say, I forget that, dump the data into a vector database, and that's how we use AI. It's just not true. And that's why you see so many examples. The press is full of them of, oh, AI is disappointing in the enterprise. It's not really doing things, because that takes a huge amount of time to curate that information. You're talking about extract, transform, and load on a scale that's really never been done before. Honestly, the old world of ETL for 75 plus years, corporations have this whole ETL environment for their structured data, the databases. Snowflake is born from the name of that product, right? It comes from a schema that was traditionally used in data warehouses. They were building data marts, right? That was like 10% of the data, the structured data. Today, we know that the unstructured information, the email and the files and the interactions with customers, those are like massively much bigger. So what the vector database vendors are saying is ETL your data into us. Not surprisingly, they charge per gigabyte. Using SWIRL, you can have your AI search those repositories, use any embedding system to re-rank the results, find the best stuff without moving it, without copying it, without violating all your security edicts and compliance agreements and co-mingling your licensed data and your internal data. You don't have to do that.
And again, just for our audience to make sure we're on the same page, moving the data can mean many different things. For the RAG systems we implement, sometimes we run them locally, sometimes we run them in the cloud, sometimes we're running on the vendor cloud. Regardless of where you're doing it, even if you're running it locally, you give examples of emails and documents. When you say move, you mean move the data out of its natural repository, where it's an email inbox or a document repository, into a RAG vector database, regardless of where that database resides.
The idea of bulk copying the data is ridiculous. And in fact, you just made my case, right? You said RAG vector database. You do not need a vector database to do RAG. They're in no way, shape, or form need to be combined. The idea that RAG is owned by the vector database is absurd. Look at an older technology like OpenSearch. They have RAG. Everybody has RAG. Everybody has embeddings now. It's a technology. It's a commodity. And it might work for you for one scenario. If you have a bad old search engine, maybe one of the vector databases would be a better way to do it. It's not required. You can use AI today without moving your data, without a big ETL project, and without risking your job sending it out to some unknown third party with a questionable SOC 2.
At ODSC West, there was a talk titled RAG is Dead, which I thought was very interesting. And I really want to go to that talk, but I didn't get time. I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts a couple of weeks ago. And again, one of the co-hosts mentioned that in the long term, they don't see any use for RAG. The reason they did is part of me thinks this is bullshit, but part of me thinks this could be true. They believe that the context windows will get so large, it will diminish the need for RAG, which I have a hard time believing. But their main point is that RAG in the long term will be dead. It's an intermediate solution. Do you agree with that statement?
I think RAG is perfectly reasonable as a long-term pattern. That doesn't mean it won't be replaced by something better. The context window is important too. Right now, you're feeding it your data onesie twosie. The one thing missing a bit is facts. What are facts that an LLM should agree with? Over time, we're going to get into context windows that are editorially controlled. So you can say, this is the steering document of facts for our company or something like that. That's a little bit in the future, but I think that's an important element because it's not just fine tuning so that your LLM understands your business jargon, the relationships between the words you use and the effects you think they'll produce, right? And the domain specific knowledge like acronyms and also a little bit about people, right? Somewhat the way to be smart inside a company is to know who to talk to. That's a lot of the value, right? And that we bring as humans to the picture. That kind of context is actually very valuable, but that doesn't make it a substitute for the information we need to give them. So you might give it the employee handbooks and you might give it sustainability reports and the annual company report and other internal procedures. And you might teach it about some of the specifics. If you have a training program for new analysts or project managers that shows your way, you should bloody well be expecting to give that to your LLM. That's going to make your LLM understand your business. But that isn't the same as saying that does not educate it as to what was revenue in this division for this product for this 1 month period in this part of the world. That's data as opposed to knowledge. Fine tune for knowledge, use RAG to access data. And that's going to be the winning trend for this current wave. What happens after that? That's harder to predict.
I'm sure our audience can hear the passion. Those are some very good points. Let me ask the tough question here because we've been following at ODSC federated learning for a long time, which is completely different from federated search. They're different technologies, but there are some commonalities. One problem is the communication overhead, right? I don't know if that's still a problem where with federated search, you are trying to look at all these disparate data sources. Sounds awesome. When you take different data sources and convert them into embeddings using semantic search, and again, your point about vector databases and RAG are not the same thing. Very excellent point. But you're making that data homogeneous in a certain sense. When you're using federated search, you've got a data heterogeneity. Your data is not quite the same. You're dealing with different types of data. How big a challenge is that currently in federated search, and is AI helping solve that problem?
I love this question. This is like the crux of it. It really is. Federated search, you send out your query, you get back results from a bunch of different things. And you're right, they're totally disparate. One could be a database, one could be documents, one could be little chat messages in Japanese. Doesn't have to be in English. Some of it could be from a file system. We bought a company and we hooked their file system up. So we're finding their old product brochures and stuff like that. How do we make sense of that? And for many decades, that was pretty much a showstopper for federated search. Really hard to figure that one out. So you might use it for similar data types. But that's what I realized when GPT-3 and other large embeddings models came out. That's exactly what they do. That's exactly what LLMs do. You can go into an LLM and paste anything, a screenshot, a snippet of text, a haiku, your random notes. You can give it a photo of your notes. You can copy and paste from a web page. I can write to it in Japanese. I could copy and paste a conversation that's half in Japanese. It makes amazing sense of it, right? You can ask the LM, evaluate these things, try it. It's pretty good at that stuff because it's really good at reading and understanding the contextual similarity. That's a little bit of a techie term, right? But there's an algorithm to determine the contextual similarity of two sets of text, regardless of length and language. So I agree. Prior to the emergence of the LLM, federated search was a very niche play, useful when you have similar sets of content that you wanted to access. It's a game changer with the modern LLM because it can completely understand. And you can go to my website, go to Google right now. Yeah, we can show it. Go to Google right now. If you search for Red Hat acquires, search those terms. They actually return a couple of Red Hat acquisitions now, but you'll see a lot of the results are about Red Hat being acquired by IBM. Why? It's a paid model. IBM spent a ton of money to make sure everybody heard that story. Google is a paid ad model, right? It's pay for play. That's why they've changed it a little bit. I'm glad since I started complaining. If you run that same search through Swirl, we're going to pick up results 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 that are actually Red Hat acquiring. Why? Because the LLM cares that it sees Red Hat acquires those exact words in that sequence. It doesn't like to see IBM acquires Red Hat because that's the wrong word order. We humans understand that word order matters, and so do LLMs. But old search engines that just view everything as a bag of words, they don't get it. The LLM can compare a matching Japanese haiku to my status report in English, to a database record that's an investment analyst take on something, to a record from the supply chain system that says we bought a whole bunch of it. And it'll say, the supply chain thing's not important, the haiku's perfect, and the article is second. That's why federated search is a game changer, because it harnesses the LLM the way you want it to without having a huge data movement project.
Yeah,
and unlike a lot of these, we're on premises.
Yeah, and that data movement you talk about also has serious implications for obviously not only data controls, but also data privacy.
That's right. If you take the new architecture at its word, the proposal is start up a vector database and begin dumping data in there that you think will have interesting answers. If you don't look carefully, it's a huge process. You may expose something that you didn't mean to expose. You can also put in a part of ETL is the transform part. So you can be detecting PII and removing that data. And you have to do things like detect duplicates, right? You're going to move all this data. And if one question isn't answered by a document, you have to go find that document, curate it. Furthermore, there are many great stories. I heard one recently about somebody who deployed Microsoft 365 Copilot. In Copilot, you have to add specific directories, right? Say, oh, here, go look at and index this section. And they put in a bunch of directories of very important information that they wanted everybody to have. They were all shared resources. Some time ago, somebody put a shared link into an HR folder. And that shared link ended up right under the folder. So that HR folder with lots of employment offers got indexed. No one noticed until that summer, a summer intern began asking questions about what's the CEO of our company paid, and it answered.
Ouch.
So that's one of the very real dangers of violating zero trust. That directory, no one could see that directory, even though there was a link to it. No one but the HR people could actually traverse the link. They could see it, click the link, but they couldn't get to it because they're not authorized to see that SharePoint site, that OneDrive. We all live in this world. This is standard technology. But when you tell Copilot, you can go have this, and the link's there, and Copilot's running as a system administrator, a service account, that's new permissions. You just created new permissions and you expose that data. Whenever you take fine-grained data that's been secured and move it to a new repository, you run the risk of dropping or not correctly modeling the ECLs. And the problem becomes much worse as soon as you begin merging data from different schemes. The safest way to use AI is to follow the enterprise grain, which is zero trust. There's a system, every big company has single sign-on. The key to making federated search work is to integrate it with the single sign-on. So the user is never able to see anything they weren't already authorized to see. As soon as you start moving data and making new silos, you have to worry about permissions. Tell you a great story. When I worked at Fast Search and Transfer, one of the top search companies that was acquired by Microsoft for $1.4 billion at the time, it was a big acquisition. Fast was amazingly effective. People loved the product and it worked incredibly well. Every one of those projects, there was a long pause between finishing the initial setup of the system and going live. The reason was the security team. Since they knew they were merging data from multiple sensitive systems, they would have to do a lot of security testing. It could happen to any company. I saw it happen to just about every search company out there one time or another. You get shut down because you don't have the ACLs modeled correctly. So another point is don't put that stuff out to your customers before you've tried it a lot internally. There have also been some great stories about LLMs hallucinating return policies and then the company actually having to follow that policy. Since you made an agent your official spokesman, you have to live with it. Testing internally is another key point. If employees can't find sensitive information, it means the AI won't expose it.
All right, Sid, you're throwing down the gauntlet, AI search versus RAG. Let's talk about building out AI search, because if someone came to me and says, I want to build a basic RAG stack, right? So I got my documents, as we talked about. You'll do your data pre-processing because you have to process data if you're going to move it. You'll figure out your chunking mechanism, your embedding generation. You'll do your vector store setup. You'll pick your favorite vector database. You'll figure out your retrieval mechanism. You'll figure out which LLM you want to use. And then hopefully you're doing some kind of a system evaluation. And then your re-ranker. So that's my, as you said, standard architecture RAG stack. Tell me, what is the AI search stack?
Gotcha. So first of all, that sounds like a ton of work. And that's my point.
Nice.
It's a ton of work. And worse, whenever some new embeddings comes along, look, DeepSeek shows up, oh, but we were using ADA. Okay, now you have to start over, start refeeding your data, and maybe your vector database supports or doesn't.
But
This
just because you want the same embedding models as the LLM model, you want to keep them, yes.
If you're going to use embeddings or DeepSeek with embeddings, you want to have them consistent.
Just so I make sure our audience got that point, because that's a very important point, because they're like, why do you have to change the embeddings if you're using DeepSeek?
If you want to use their embeddings, right, you're going to want to re-embed your data. Vector databases are very much oriented around a steady state, but you're not in a steady state. Every week, there's an amazing new LLM, an incredible new update, and the common thread is that they all need access to your data to provide you with a ChatGPT type of experience. So you're going to be very good at refeeding data, patiently waiting for all of that data to re-embed. Let's take a look at the AI stack. You actually don't need a re-ranker in the traditional RAG stack because you're going to put all the data in the vector database. So it's going to be responsible for regular relevancy ranking, not re-ranking, right? The vector database claim to fame is that because they use embeddings, they have richer query capabilities, or they're more precise, or they're better at long queries. It depends a lot on your content, the type of embeddings you use, and how clever you are about chunking the content. It takes some expertise.
So did you say that in RAG, you do not need a re-ranker for your results?
So the main point in RAG is you're going to put your data in a vector database.
Yeah.
That's going to do your ranking. It's a search engine. So it's going to give you a rank based on the embeddings, whether it's a K nearest neighbor.
Yeah, I would say that most of the ones that it's like the RAG results, and maybe the data wasn't good enough, we definitely had to use a re-ranker, something like a Cohere re-ranker. I think we used an open source one recently as well.
Their re-ranker is better than a lot of straight search engines. It takes a lot of expertise to configure relevance. I worked with a big publisher. They had a huge amount of content and they were obsessed with using embeddings, and they had an excellent state-of-the-art search engine with embeddings. There was one problem. For almost every query you would run in a domain, you'd get the same documents back, the exact same one, consistently over and over again. And it's because the embeddings in this case were too broad, were too focused on recall. All the things it was bringing back were relevant, but none of them were precise. So now let's take the AI stack. The AI stack says you don't have to move the data. Search means no moving the data. At most, you could build an index, but even that isn't necessary. In the case of re-ranking, you do hybrid search. So what's hybrid search means? It means we send the user's keyword query out to lots of sources, like OneDrive. OneDrive doesn't accept embeddings today. It just accepts keywords. Okay, you take responses from OneDrive or other search engines and vectorize them. You can do that quickly. You're not talking about a massive amount of data. You're talking about what one search engine thinks is most relevant to your query. So you take 10 or 20 or 50 results if you need it, right? You can decide how many results you want to take, and then you re-rank those using embeddings. SWIRL is going to dig out, or the re-ranker is going to dig out results 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 that are actually about Red Hat acquiring companies or buying companies. So that's the first stage, right? You need a re-ranker in AI search. Oh,
Okay.
especially in federated search. Now, if you want to index all the data, that's what a vector database does, right? Your approach, the RAG stack is move the data into a search engine or vector database, rank, and RAG. And really, the R in RAG, that's what we're talking about. The alternative, the AI search model or the meta search model, right? Send the query out to your existing search engines. You've got dozens of them, like Outlook. There are well-defined APIs for all these things.
The query said, you're talking about a generative query, right?
It could be a user typing a question or just a keyword, right? They could be writing a full prompt, though. They could say something like, I'm trying to find the status report for project X for last quarter, or I'm trying to understand what was customer service according to surveys in EMEA last month. It can be anything like that. Here's the really cool thing. You can use AI at all different levels. First, you can have the user write the query. You can have the user talk to an LLM, and the LLM can help the user. For example, we turn any LLM into a powerful search assistant. It knows what you're authorized to see and it can know a lot about what's in those sources. Now you can say, I'm trying to find customer service for EMEA for this product for last month. And it can come back and say, I think that data is in Snowflake, or you might need to check Colibra, or it's probably in ThoughtSpot, or actually there might be a SharePoint site that covers customer satisfaction reports. Would you like me to search those? Now, you say yes, and it runs a search for you. This is the second part. It can pick a way better search than you can. For example, one of those is a database. OpenAI's GPT-4o speaks 10 variations of SQL. So if that thing's a Google BigQuery database or a Postgres database or Oracle database, it can write the query, even if you can't, right? It's really the democratization of data happens through search assistants who understand all the weird variations like date sorting, or you have to write a JSON query, you have to select your collections, so it can guide you. The AI can be working in the background to make sure your query turns into a great query. Maybe you're a new hire and didn't know that at our company, we refer to this type of issue as a resolutions queue. If the LLM knows that through, say, fine tuning of knowledge and things like employee handbooks, it can adapt the query for the user and make sure they don't miss that. The next point, you're never generating stuff directly from the model. You're always doing RAG, right? So we send out the query, get back the results, re-rank, and then we're going to take the most relevant documents, extract the text, the most relevant parts of those documents, if they're long, and then we package that up into the prompt that goes to the AI. So it's the same part after, right? The R in RAG is everything. Swirl's approach is you have retrieval out there. Let's use what you have and re-rank what we get back so you don't have to move the data and there's no security issues. You can just start and rank. We bind that to the prompt, we send it to the AI. Now here's the last part is it gives you the answer. It saves you a ton of time by reading the documents so that you don't have to. The example I do all the time is, how much cyber insurance do I have as a company? I have $1 million. Now that I know, I forget what are the specific things it covers. It tells me by finding the most recent insurance plan that I just purchased. We just rolled it over last month. And so I ask the same question. It gives me the new parameters.
Gotcha. So basically, can I sum this up? It's what you guys are doing at Swirl. It's RAG, but you can ditch the vector database.
Correct.
Without keep it. It can be a data source.
Over the years, I saw that if you're more than 500 person company, you probably have at least 3 search engines already. And I'm guessing maybe a bunch of LLMs. This stuff is never going to stop or go away.
Yeah.
But you need an infrastructural approach. Like a lot of great thinkers in technology, right? Like Aaron Levy at Box. He's writing all the time about how important the architecture that you choose for AI is. It's not about the hype AI or LLM of the day. There's going to be another amazing one tomorrow. They all need access to your data. That's the way that you're going to make it work for your business. Having the right architectural underpinnings is critical. If you want to move data and you're great at it, that's one model.
So Sid, you're making some excellent points there, but you stated earlier, you made a comment about the zero trust model. The zero trust security approach is where nothing is inherently trusted and you always want to verify access, et cetera. But let's talk about the LLMs, because LLMs aren't large language models of vulnerability, because we've seen with DeepSeek, for example, that the government's trying to outlaw that. I haven't been keeping up with the news in DeepSeek, but I just checked my DeepSeek app and I checked in the App Store. It's still available in the App Store. Yeah, isn't that a concern in terms of privacy?
I think it's a very real concern. And I think it's another reason that companies are moving slowly with AI. So DeepSeek shows up. It's amazing. It's much cheaper than the incumbents. So why wouldn't I try it? The law in China is that data has to stay and be resident in China. And actually the laws, I think they're fairly similar to the laws in the United States, which is any Chinese company that's operating and holding data has to respond to governmental requests for information, right? For security or intelligence purposes, whatever those are. I think it's basically the same here. So if you use an LLM that's not in your environment, meaning like you haven't deployed it and controlled it, if it's a third party, you are exposing information to them. Obviously, privacy policies are a great place to start, right? What's their privacy policy? But ultimately, there's some measure of trust, because we all know that there's an admin who can go and look at the data, right? More than likely at some low level can get in and look at the data. There are log files, right? Every system that gets deployed, it's very common that their log files end up with some of the information. And of course, we know why these companies do this, so they can improve their products. They're not doing it to spy on you, but at the end of the day, when information gets captured, there is a risk. Most of the firms that are working with Swirl today are doing so partly because they have an on-prem or private cloud LLM strategy, right? They are not using a third party. They may use one of the biggest cloud providers, but they're not going to try random SaaS company. And then they want something they can deploy in their own environment and control themselves. They're very concerned about loss of stewardship or control of it.
What's stopping people? Because DeepSeek is open source. You're not
Okay.
sending, if you're using the app, the DeepSeek app, you are sending your data to the app, but you can deploy DeepSeek locally.
Yes,
And the weights are open source, and that would remove that concern to a certain degree.
absolutely. In fact, I think the folks I know of who are using DeepSeek are using a DeepSeek distilled version of Llama or some other, and yes, they're running it locally. I can actually run it locally on my MacBook, which has some GPU support. That said, DeepSeek has a pretty high hallucination rate. It doesn't have a lot of the protections and barriers that are present in some of the leading models. So I think it's always going to be a little bit of a catch up. But when it comes to the large enterprise and the safe use of these things, there's a good reason that the largest players are expensive and enterprise focused, right? It's because they understand the problem a lot better. But even they don't have a strategy for getting their system safely to your data. That's another interesting fact.
Yeah, exactly. I was looking at the app on my phone earlier in the DeepSeek terms of services. This is the app, by the way. The app itself states that all the data will be stored in China. A lot of LLM providers says we're not using your data. Who knows to what extent that is true? DeepSeek, their data retention policy says we will keep your user data for as long as necessary to provider services. Right? What does that mean? Provider service to me or somebody else? And then the one that's really scary is consent's required by the law. You got to abide by local laws, but DeepSeek reserves the right to review user behavior and information, including inputs and outputs, to fulfill legal and compliance requirements. But again, we talked about deploying DeepSeek locally. One of my favorite tools to deploy open source LLMs locally is Llama. I'll include that in the show notes. That begs the question, why are people sending their data to Anthropic, to OpenAI, and why are they not using these open source models on-prem or in their own private cloud?
So I think that it really comes down to capability. The reason the largest enterprises are not using the open source models is they don't quite match the Anthropics, OpenAI's, Google's, et cetera, right? There really is a difference. And it comes back to that hallucination plus the safety guidelines that they follow. I think that the open source models are going to win. They always do.
It will,
That,
1,000%.
the fascinating thing is, even though OpenAI, who I admire massively, did not come up with most of the technologies they used to build GPT-4, it's really been primarily Google with the transformer architecture and attention. I think the macro is ultimately the price of the LLMs is going to come down. That's what DeepSeek shows is likely to happen. And when that happens, I think they will begin to become more enterprise friendly. And essentially, I think the mistake is to think of it, and now I'm really just opining here. I think that LLMs and GAIs as SaaS platforms is a consumer play. I think that organizations, enterprises are going to want their own private instance that can have cross-user memory. That's actually one of the most important things, is the idea that you're going to create this bigger memory than just one user's stream of consciousness or session. If that is bound to the company, that will become a powerful, valuable asset. And imagine also a model where you can start to choose the intelligence sources. So everybody will have this base intelligence, right, that we get from the web. And then you say, oh, look, I'm a STM company, so I want Elsevier's add-on intelligence, right, which is from 50, 100 years of peer-reviewed articles from all the top stuff. If I'm setting it up for a law firm, right, maybe it's Lexis and Westlaw, right, maybe they will have AIs that I can harness, right? I think that's the way to think about it, that the AIs will evolve. And the key is, how do you provide your data to them in such a way that your users can benefit? There's no end to what will change.
No, I 100% agree with you that open source will win this race. And yeah, the models cost have been coming down. The token cost has been coming down. It's interesting. So let's talk about agentic AI. Where's the AI search play for agentic AI?
I actually think this is a really interesting question because agentic is so hot and it has so much potential. But let's take a step back. Agentic is just the idea that we could use an LLM through prompt engineering, right? Which I think is a super important point, to do long running tasks. right? Not just like today, GPT-4 type of question, get an answer. But we're seeing things like go off and research this for me. Spend a lot more time. Give me a deeper answer. So the idea of agents is awesome. I think it's important to think of it as a technology approach, decoupling LLMs with specific missions, letting them work together. I think that's where the real power will come from. In the same way that LLMs need access to your data, so does the whole agentic plan. If you're going to build a bunch of agents, how do they get the data that they need? If you build agents that have access to one or two APIs, they're very limited, right? Then you're going to be building all these agents. Now let's take the second part, which is prompt engineering. Nowadays with prompt engineering, it should take, and LangChain or another open source project, it should take you 10 minutes to set up some kind of a search, federated search against 2-3 sources. The problem becomes when you start to deal with many more of them. That's when the power of LLMs and re-ranking takes it from simple to strategic. If you can add new sources at a rate of 1 a day or 1 an hour, that's a game changer, right? We have to build this big thing, and now we have all these connectors, and we can't figure out where to cut off the relevancy, how to do re-ranking. Lots of people have died on those hills. Now you're back to prompt engineering and agents, and you're keeping it simpler, but data access becomes a problem. How do we get the data access? AI search. One of the keys to making your agent strategy successful is having one API that they can all use to access information, especially if that API is secure. Think of it. The power of AI and the danger of it is you can apply for a job. You have a person who's doing a job. In theory, an AI, a series of agents, could do the same work. It has to be able to access all the same sources, going from tab to tab, logging into each one, running searches or navigating through the hierarchy, finding the relevant information, and then doing whatever they've been asked to do. If your employees can't find the information, your agents aren't going to be able to find it either. 2 of our most recent deployments are in support of agents. The company built their own agents. The goal of the agents, various. In one case, it's literally to answer questions from a data science group, right? So they can ask all the time, where would I find this? How would I work with this? And so they're building an autoresponder. That's really all it is, right? It's an autoresponder that understands the history of that and can answer those questions just to take the heat off them.
I do genuinely believe that you're laying out an alternative architectural vision in search that really is very important, Sid. Tell us about the open source version. You mentioned there's a couple of thousand stars there. We already talked about building our AI stack. What's possible with the open source version of SWIRL that you have on GitHub?
You can get it running in literally 2 commands if you have Docker running. It could not be simpler. You'll run the command and then wait 5 minutes and Docker will be up and running. The thing we focus on at SWIRL is configuration, not coding. You don't need a single developer. Most power users can get SWIRL up and running. Only thing you can put in SWIRL are keys, bearer tokens, or you can do a M365 app registration, which will allow your SWIRL installation and you run it on your laptop. We do offer hosting, but our recommendation is you host it yourself so that the system is never outside your control. No SWIRL admins can get access to your system. It's 100% under your control in your environment. After you put in your keys or integrate with the single sign-on, the open source version only supports Microsoft as the IDP. When you have that up and running, you can run and you don't ever need to pay SWIRL. It's under the Apache license. You can take it apart, build it into your product, build it into your website, and it includes a really high quality cross-silo RAG with our re-ranker. You can get it running in 5 minutes.
That sounds awesome, Sid. I'm going to include that in the show notes. A huge thanks to you and the team for making this open source, because making this stuff accessible so we can learn from it and help us solve problems is so valuable. The hot topic we mentioned already is agentic AI. What do you think the impact of agentic AI automated workflows is on future skill sets, even go as far as employment?
I think it's really hard to predict about employment. I do think that for years, there's going to be a long wave where the expertise of prompt engineering, being able to direct AIs and agents to understand how to architect and manage these things and how to deploy them, that's not simple. They're very different. And so I think there's going to be a big role for IT and the data owners and infrastructure owners to make it happen. It could be a long time. These things either happen much faster or much slower than we think they will. But I think that given the difficulty of data sprawl in the enterprise, it's going to take a while. I really do believe that's the future for IT. I think for business, there's an open question. AI is the first technology that we could envision applying for a job. If we look back, just looking backwards, last 20, 30, 40 years of applications, Take the best web app like Asana or Jira. I love those apps because I spend a lot of time in ticket systems. They're awesome applications, but they are just that. They capture tickets. They're useful for reporting and for managing my queue. But I can imagine that if I had an AI that could access the data, I'd never need the application again. So before we see the end of employment, we see the end of applications because everyone is working with agents who have access to the data models, and there's no need for the app so much. Why do you buy Jira? You buy it for the data entry and the ability to find stuff, right? So I can search and look through. If it's just another data source, I just ask me what was new in Jira today? What were the new tickets? Which ones were high priority? Which ones were assigned to me? Which ones am I late on? That, all of a sudden, who cares if it's Jira now? We have gone out of the brands and software. That's what's going to fade. The work is what becomes possible. Now that leads to the next thing, which is, so today, if you are, let's take something like tax, right? Tax notices. There's a group in every finance company that's responsible for paying taxes, dealing with tax notices. What is a tax notice? It's a notice that you owe something. It comes in, right? So you could have, this is an example, you could have an AI that does that job. You could have a job that does that's already being done, right? My son just found a job. He's going through an onboarding process. It's an AI. The AI asks him, you need to provide your, right? So upload your driver's license, right? It goes through the I-9 requirements. That's what's going to be changing, right? Agents can actually do a task from start to finish. Reach out to new hire, collect this information, fill out these forms, put this data into the system, confirm that this was done, make this filing, and then send the onboarding note. You're done. Your first day is this day, and here's your door key, right? That's the agents, and that's the biggest shift in the software market. AI enabled to think past applications, and agent lets us think past data to actual work.
Speaking of employment, I was checking out the DOE website the other day, if I pronounced that correctly, the Department of Government Efficiency. So one of the posts there was, let me read out this post to you. In 2020 to 2021, the Small Business Administration issued 3,095 loans for a total of $333 million. It gave out 395 of these loans to borrowers who were over 115 years old, right? And then there's a whole big blow up. Look at all this fraud. How can this be true? Wouldn't you think the first thing that they would do is check the data? Maybe it's a typo. Yeah, give me your take on that.
So I think this is a super interesting question. Remember Y2K?
Yeah, I was.
Everybody
I
knows.
was the intern at a company. I got cash out the day before. ATMs are going to stop. So you're hungover after New Year's Day. You made sure you had money in the bank and you had milk and eggs and whatever.
Everybody freaked out, and I was working at a big insurance company at the time. They had lots of mainframes and used COBOL a lot. One of the things about COBOL is it's not great at handling dates the way modern computers do. One explanation is that most of the Social Security Administration systems run on COBOL, and if there's a missing value, it's based on 1875 as the starting date. So I think that's 150 years from now. Anyway, so it's basically looks like an error. And of course, this is a very legitimate problem, which is if you don't understand your customers, AI is not going to help you. I think it can help you understand someone else's customers, perhaps. But it is, I think there's two things that are interesting there. The first one is when you bring in a bunch of new techies and they look at a really old system, they're very likely to misinterpret it, right? Maybe they found fraud, or maybe it's just date math error and it's just missing values. I'm sure they'll sort that out. The second part is, we talked earlier about zero trust. The thing that was interesting about that story is the newspaper's characterization that they're like ripping the data out of all these government repositories, feeding it into AI to find it. By the way, that is what the first generation is, right? They probably were feeding it into a vector database and then using that database with the LLM to do analysis. In the government space, one assumes they did that in a compartment, right? And then they deleted the compartment afterwards. So the government is much better at dealing with secure data than the average enterprise. At least that's what I've heard. So giving them the benefit of the doubt, that would be a safe way to do it. But imagine doing the same thing in your enterprise. If you work at a really big company and you're using a vector database, the odds are high you're doing the exact same thing right now.
But if you're doing AI search on these government databases, isn't that going to lead to brittle AI systems and going back to agentic AI systems? I can see the wheels coming off the bus here because you're only as good as the data. And with search, you're not pre-processing the data as much, right? So correct me if I'm wrong, but you're not doing the pre-processing. And perhaps if they pre-process the data correctly, they would have caught this issue.
Sure.
Assuming this was the issue. And again, we don't know what the issue is. Maybe there is all these fraud. Maybe there's not. I don't know. I'm not being presumptuous here. Just
No, me either. I think it's really interesting, right? Because how often do you really get to talk about this kind of problem at this scale? So I just posted a link to a Wired article about this where they talk about 150 years old being related to the COBOL thing. But you're absolutely right. Why in the heck is a Social Security Administration run on an ancient system with COBOL? Why does it have that error? This is another awesome opportunity for LLMs. And actually, I think this is one of the more interesting ones. LLMs, through the search lens, can be used to start to improve your data. For example, you could tell an LLM there can't be anyone 150 years old. Like that just does not happen in nature.
not 3,095 of them, that's for sure.
Definitely not hundreds of them. I think that would be a TV show in and of itself, though over 100. But anyway, I think the other angle to say is this is where, and probably the government hasn't super fast at getting into this stuff, but it's an opportunity for government and for enterprise. Take the data and pass it through an LLM and ask the LLM to improve the data. Right. So an LLM, for example, could look at a record and say, there's no way that this person is alive. They were born in 1875, right? So it could identify which records have that problem and queue them for some kind of a review process. LLMs are amazing at classification and pattern detection. There's a whole tech area now called generative AI augmented retrieval. Wow, that's a mouthful. But what Garth says is, let's say you have a bunch of data, like let's say you have a bunch of PDFs that you built yourself, right? Hand-built set of PDFs. They're excellent articles except for one thing. Half of them don't have titles. And some of them don't have an author field. The author's buried somewhere in the document. This isn't great for search. Feed each article to an LLM and have the LLM rewrite the article. Generate a title for this based on the body. Figure out who the author is based on what's in the body and put that name into this field. You can suddenly take your not so great data and make it a heck of a lot better. The upside of LLMs is not only to make sense of the data, but actually to help us improve the data. And this is a great opportunity to go in and say, having a digital government is an interesting option. I think there are many examples. Look at Estonia as an example of a country that went digital. All voting is digital, all taxes, everything's paid digitally. I think there's an upside and a downside to those things, but it's definitely a thing.
Yeah. Sid, excellent. Fantastic conversation. I'm sure people want to hear from you again. How can people follow your work?
Find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter, I guess now X, or find me at swirlaiconnect.com. Always love to meet folks who are trying to solve this problem.
Yeah, and what a problem it is. I think you've given us a masterclass on how to solve this problem. Really appreciate that. So Sid, again, as always, really enjoyed the chat.
Oh, same here. And Seamus, I can't thank you enough for inviting us. And obviously all props and love to ODSC for supporting and driving open source, which we're big believers in, having started there and hopefully being there forever.
Yeah, appreciate all your time commitment to open source, and definitely will be checking out the SWIRL repo. Thank you so much again, Sid.
Thanks, Seamus.
Your engagement directly contributes to the growth and success of our community. Please subscribe now and don't miss out on the next enlightening episode. Today's episode is sponsored by ODSC East, the leading AI and data science training conference this May 13th to 15th in Boston and virtually. Learn more about the event at odsc.com/Boston, and don't forget to use the code ODSC Podcast for an additional 10% off. Supporting our podcast by subscribing not only helps our small dedicated team at ODSC, but also unlocks exclusive benefits for you.